We're going to talk about storytelling today. I think you know that. Obviously, you saw the title of the talk and you're here, so we're going to go ahead and assume that. But I want to start out by talking about what's really on my mind, and I'm going to take a guess and assume it's what's on a lot of your minds as well. Who's going for cocktails later? Anybody? Just me? Let me see a show of hands. All right, fantastic. You in the orange jacket, what's your plan?
I'm going to take my girlfriend out, too.
Fantastic. Where are you going? I want to come.
We're actually going to go over to the Highline Canal and watch the flow box show.
Awesome. Fantastic. Who else? Who else has got a plan already? Anybody? Oh, you know I'm going to call on you now, don't you? Oh, no. You're going to drink there, right? All right. Well, the point is that those of us that are lucky enough to be going out for a cocktail later, we're hoping to have a good time. We're hoping to meet up with friends. We're hoping to have a lot of fun. There's probably a couple of us that are really hoping to get lucky as well. These are not requirements that we check off of a list. These are emotional experiences that we want to engage with each other, human to human, one to one. And so my question for you is, if this is how we talk about the experiences that we have in our regular lives, our real lives, why do we insist on telling the stories about the products that we create like that? Hopefully that's how the night is going to end for most of you. But as we look to the way that we talk about software historically, does anybody not know what either of these documents are? Has anybody not ever seen these before? All right. Well, hopefully we never see this thing on the left anymore. This is a user interface specification. I used to work a lot with these about 10 years ago. I hope we don't ever see them again. But on the right, the things that we see every day at Effective UI are a lot of software that's written and designed and whose soul is contained in a software requirements document. And that's tough to work with, let me tell you. I'm sure a lot of you out there know. So let's talk about the important question then. Whose fault? I blame this guy, Henry Ford. He did a lot of great things. He figured out how to produce a lot of shit really fast. But what he didn't do so well is give us time to live and breathe and create stories around the products that we want to put out into the marketplace that are actually going to matter to people. Not that are usable and functional and all that great stuff, but things that actually matter. His basic idea is make 100,000 Model Ts as fast as you can. And to be honest, I think a lot of people are still working in that mindset. Make 100,000 iPhone apps as fast as you can. Make as much business software as you can, as quickly as you can, get it out to as many people as you can, and we'll figure out if it's usable later. So now that we know where we came from, let's talk about why we're still there and why we can't break out of it, and maybe how storytelling can help. I know a lot of us think that our offices look like old cubes and maybe some glass and steel and a nice office park somewhere, or if you're lucky, maybe an old warehouse. But what they really look like inside the matrix is that. They're just a bunch of factories, and at worst, a bunch of siloed factories. And what do siloed factories expect? Siloed factories expect as an input something that's fully baked, something that's reliable, something that's the same all the time, and something that isn't wrong. And being wrong is exactly what we do every day. Because to explore and to create the right experience, we have to be able to be wrong. And siloed factories don't allow us to be wrong. So as we start to talk a little bit about what storytelling is, how it can help us, and what it can really mean for the products that we create, we're going to have to pull out a bulldozer. And that bulldozer is a storytelling bulldozer. You're going to need to clear the path, make some space, and make some people uncomfortable. You're going to have to cross those silos. And that doesn't mean it's hard. That doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means that you're going to have to get up and do something. Integrating storytelling into creating not just a great experience, but a truly engaging experience isn't about creating another deliverable, adding another 50 pages to that findings deck that you created. It's about throwing a lot of that out the window and talking to people. We'll talk a little more about this later. Does this look familiar to anybody? Yeah, I bet so. This is an actual example of a project timeline, but I swear to God, it looks like probably 50% of the ones that come across our desks. Should look pretty standard to most people, right? We define some scope up front. We create some wireframes. Maybe we actually get to prototype. That's great. That's something kind of new. And then, of course, there's architecture, documentation, building the thing. Well, this is great. I think we should all stop and give ourselves a round of applause because this isn't what these project timelines looked like about 10 years ago. About 10 years ago, when I started out, there was one line, that green line, and that was it. It was basically get up, get started, get funding, and go. That's it. We'll figure out the problems later. We'll figure out the UI later. And so while we've spent all of this time as UX professionals, as folks in marketing, as developers, all of us have put in the time to convince the business folks that we work with that doing user-centered activities as part of software development is important. That's great. We've played by their rules for a bunch of years, and now we're justified. People are starting to understand what we do. If you work at an agency, you're getting calls in the door. If you work in an enterprise or a business, someone hired you, and people understand what you do to some degree. And so that's great. However, now that we've taken a look at that, it's also time for us to kind of take a look at the deliverables that we produce. As UX professionals, as designers, as anybody that participates in a design activity at all, we produce deliverables. And we've produced deliverables that make sense to business people who read metrics and who understand business intelligence. And we've produced deliverables that help to tell a story. But let's be honest, we've been pretty execution focused too. A persona, a journey map, a user story, these are all deconstructed pieces of the actual story we're trying to tell. And so often we go right here, or we go right into our generative research, our user interviews, figuring that the more users we talk to, the more well-defined and the clearer the story is going to be that we're going to be able to build up around the product or experience that someone on the management track has decided needs to be put out. Well, it's time for us to take a step back, to stop creating deliverables that are fueling this execution-focused fire and start to make a little space for ourselves, start to be wrong. So I've been standing up here talking for, 5-6 minutes, and we haven't talked that much about storytelling. So you might be wondering where it is in all this. Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is a lot of it's already there. Those journey maps, those personas, that research that we do, both generative and evaluative, the usability testing, all of that stuff. We don't want to throw that away. That's all part of the storytelling. But what we're missing is what happens before all of that. What so rarely happens before all of that, and I guarantee you what happens when we see amazing products and amazing experiences come out, is that people take a guess. This is what happens in startups every day, throughout the country, throughout the world. You make a guess, you figure out what you think about how this product, how this service, how your iPhone, how your Android, whatever it is, fits into the lives of the people, the users that are actually going to be using your product. And not just when they're there tapping away and writing tweets and checking their email, but what happens after they set that device down? What happens after they log off their system at work at night and go home? What the experience really means to them as a part of their lives, because everyone's life is more important than any experience that we're ever going to build, period. And so the big story is what's missing, the inspiration for the product. And what that really boils down to is something that I like to talk about as the theme. One of our colleagues, Cindy Chastain, who some of you may know, kind of coined this term from a usability-focused perspective, and she, in turn, borrowed a great quote from a book that if you haven't picked up or read, I would highly recommend it, by Robert McKee called Story. And when he talks about theme, he talks about it as one clear, coherent sentence that expresses a story's irreducible meaning. Now that's in terms for him of screenwriting, but it's the exact same thing when we're talking about experiences. If you can take a step back, if you and your colleagues, your teams, whoever you can grab, can take a guess at a truly believable story about how that iPhone app you're working on is going to be used, how that enterprise business intelligence system is going to be used, if you can actually tell yourself a story that you're not calling bullshit on in the same sentence, that's the genesis of this theme. And then once those stories start to come out, I guarantee you'll come down to this singular phrase, this idea, this thought, that will not only help to kind of crystallize your direction, but it will also give you, most importantly, something to start validating against. So when you go do that user research, when you go do those user interviews, that you're actually validating against something, not just taking a guess and flowing down the river of user information that comes out at you. So some of you might be asking, well, wasn't that the promise of personas? We've sunk a lot of money into developing personas. We have a really robust set. Hell, they're hanging all over the room in our executive war room so that even our management has to look at it. Well, yeah, that's what personas are supposed to do. But I don't know about you. This doesn't inspire me and my team. We produce these things. They're important. They're very important to the work that we're going to get to eventually once we get to mapping out experience maps and wireframes and figuring out where we can emotionally engage people where they're not engaged already. But you know what? This doesn't remind me of a story that I can believe in, that I want to tell, that makes sense to me about why the new banking app that we're designing is going to be better for someone than going into their branch, than going back on their computer, than doing things the way they've always done it before. That inspiring story just isn't there. So if personas are working for you like this, or deliverables like this are really inspiring everybody to believe, then you just save yourself about half an hour. You can go have that cocktail right now. But for a lot of us, we need something else. And that something else is the story that we've been talking about, and really what it boils down to is about making space. About running off into the woods, into a cabin, turning off all your electronics, and making the space to figure out the story. You don't actually have to do that. You can if you like. But the point is that we need to make space. The space to create those stories that we believe in. So how might we start approaching that? Well, one way that we like to think about starting to create this story is to think about something that Don Norman started talking about a long time ago. When he wrote Emotional Design, he talked about the 3 ways that products can emotionally engage us. And we've been focusing on this. I'm not telling anyone anything new here. But what we've really been doing is focusing on that middle piece, behavioral engagement, making things usable, making recall high, making recognition high, making things usable, right? Well, there's 2 other pieces to that 3-part equation that maybe we haven't been paying as much attention to as we should. The visceral. We've seen a lot of this lately. For every Jacob Nielsen that tells us that usability is going to trump aesthetically pleasing interfaces or product design, I think we have an example from the past 5 years to throw back in his face, to be frank. The reflective, and this is the one that I think we can really, really take advantage of as we start to tell our stories. What's the lasting impression that your experience has on your users? When I go and make that bank transfer on that iPhone app, and I walk away, and I go have dinner, I go have a drink with my friends, I go back to work, I'm not thinking about banking at all. What kind of lasting impression is that leaving on me, and what kind of expectations is that setting for me about the next interface that I'm going to use, and the next one after that? When we start to think about how to engage in all of these 3 ways equally, not just the easy one, the behavioral one, we start to understand what it is to tell the story up front that we need in order to validate the experiences that we really want to create, the ones that are lasting, the ones that aren't throwaway. So let's talk about that bulldozer again. To actually do this, you're going to need to roll this out. You're going to need to be a little sneaky, and you're going to need to knock down some walls without anybody knowing about it. So fire it up quietly if you can. To do this realistically, what you're probably going to need to do is find time in the project schedules you already have. when you start estimating, estimate an extra couple of days in there. This really doesn't have to be hard. You just need to make a little bit of space for yourself. It doesn't take much. It really doesn't take much to create that story. I think you'd be surprised if you're not already thinking about it, how much you know inside, in your gut, about what the right product story is for the product that you're being asked to create. Most of us don't get to come up with the product ideas. Those of us that do are lucky, but most of us don't. Most of us get handed something that we need to design, that we need to develop, that we need to write content for, that we need to market. And we don't get to change a lot of those decisions, but what we can do is impress upon our colleagues to tell themselves a story and to tell us a story collectively about how people are going to use this application, this interface, this piece of hardware, and allow ourselves to call bullshit on each other about it. It doesn't take a week, it doesn't take a month. It can take 2 or 3 days, but you have to make the space to do that. Maybe you and your team get sick for a couple of days and head somewhere off site. Maybe you build those couple of days in your project schedule. Maybe you actually have management, lower management, maybe even middle management that's amenable to the idea. But whatever levers you have to pull, whatever favors you've been storing up, I promise, if you try this, take someone up on one of those favors, give you a couple extra days, and start to tell each other stories. You don't have to have materials. You can simply talk to each other. If you need to start documenting it, that's fine too. So, this all sounds really great, I'm sure, and it's easy for me to stand up here and talk about it. But I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, I'm not the boss.
I'm thinking that, and I'm going to call bullshit.
Excuse me?
Bullshit! That's great. I get it. I buy it. I love it. We all need to figure out who we're designing for. You sold me. But this is crap, man. I can't do this. There's time equals money, dude.
Right.
We have a strategic plan in our office. It's called getting shit done.
Wow. Okay. All right.
You eat up time with deliverables, right? I mean, you eat up all this time and you produce no deliverables. Like, I can't even justify this to upper management. We don't just...
Why don't you come up here for a second? Let's talk about this. We were going to talk about all this anyway, so it's fine. Solving problems is what matters. Here, you take that.
Okay, I call bullshit.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Michael Salamon, lead experience architect at Effective UI.
Effective UI. So, I agree with everything that Dan said, but I also really am calling bullshit because nobody has the time and the space in their engagements as they exist right now to allow all this wonderful Lego playing storytelling to happen, right? And design already is kind of beat up as not delivering fast enough and, you know, being the guys with tattoos that sit in the dark corner listening to death metal. Like, we don't trust them, right? So why are we going to give them 3 days to just go dick around with Play-Doh? Like, ain't going to happen. So my question to you is, time equals money, and these exercises are expensive. How am I going to get this into my timeline?
I couldn't agree with you more. This stuff is expensive. Design takes time, and we already look like a cost center in the enterprise as a whole. So what I'd say is this. There's an IBM study done, God, before UX was even the huge deal it is now. And they took a look at a couple thousand software projects, and here's what they came up with. For every dollar that we spend in design, as highly paid as we are, for every dollar that you spend paying a designer to fix a problem, it's going to cost you 100 times that if you need to fix that problem in development. I don't even want to talk about what it's going to cost if you have to fix it post-launch. And so we're talking about fixing problems before that dollar. So who knows? It hasn't been aggregated yet because we haven't had enough time to really establish this as a practice yet. But what does that take to fix in storytelling? As we articulate that story, as we figure out what that core driver, core emotional engager, is that a word, of the experience is, we're talking what, maybe 50 cents on that dollar? I think it's a pretty good deal. You pay now, you pay later.
Yeah, I agree. We're talking about the economies of scale here. Really, like, everybody knows it's easy to make than wireframes, right? But what if you haven't made that change in that wireframe? You get further on down that slope, and it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So it's for my first BS.
Well, and I think there's another thing we can talk about here as well, which is who's ever been in the middle of a design grudge match where not everyone in the room's a designer, even though they think they are? Anybody? Yeah, me too. Kind of sucks. How much do you think those things cost? 1 hour meeting that turns into 4 or 5, and then goes on the next day and the day after that. Michael told me a story one time about this. And,
yeah. I got a good one.
Yeah,
you guys can hear me, right?
It.
Okay, I worked at a company that was a online travel site way back in the day when there were still lots of them. And you know the calendar icon, right? You click it and the calendar widget pops out and you type in some dates. I probably designed like 30 calendar icons, at least 30, right? And we had at least 30 reviews where a bunch of people from the East Coast flew in and stayed over the night and ate a bunch of brunch and had a big meeting and hung out. And I started adding up how much this 30 by 30 pixel icon is really costing, right? It's crazy. It was like a $3 million button. And it didn't even do shit. All it did was you could type in the address. So when you get into these death grudge matches, right, where one developer is fighting or one manager is fighting against, like, not even the user anymore, right? It's more about, oh, that guy didn't sign my chair request last year, or he cut me off in the parking lot this morning. I'm going to totally crush his project, right? That's what we get into. And so this is kind of the way to hopefully cut that off at the pass, because that just sucks your soul right out.
It's true, and I think that using metrics like this can really create a nice 1-2 punch, because if you've gotten to this point where you're having that grudge match, you probably didn't get that storytelling time up front. And so not only can the last person in the room that they expect to come up with a bunch of metrics, the designers, bring a metric to the table, but you can use that leverage the next time to get those couple of days of storytelling time that you need to actually articulate where those engagement points are going to be, what that core of the product story is, so that you don't get in that grudge match in the first place.
Okay. So my second one, you end up all the time with no deliverables at all, right? We're in the business of deliverables. I have to show you what I'm doing, otherwise you're not going to pay me. So how do you get around this one?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think, again, the spotlight is always on us. We are never producing enough deliverables for how much they pay us and how long it takes to do design in our little design caves. Well, you know what? Stop crying and start documenting. People are always going to want documentation. They're always going to want deliverables. And so if your boss needs wireframes, then wireframes you shall make. If your boss needs a bunch of whiteboards, then that's what you need to do. The point here is there are easy ways to clear these kind of roadblocks. Give people what they need. Stop worrying about that it's not fully baked yet, because they just need it on their desk so they can drop it and hear that thud every now and then when their boss comes in the room. So it's not really about needing to commit to those things, and I know it can be tricky, but give the people what they want. And our suggestion is to start as low fidelity as humanly possible. So if you can get away with it, when a boss or a project lead or a project owner asks for wireframes, start on the whiteboard. Take a bunch of pictures and send them in an email. See what happens. If you get yelled at, which we have before for doing that, draw something on paper. If you get yelled at for that, go up to low fidelity wireframes. The point is, there is no need to start high fidelity. You can take pride in your work on a whiteboard. You can take pride in your work as a high fidelity wireframe that took you 10 times as long to make. That's what I would say.
So I agree with that too. It's right back to the user-centered design practice, right? Know your audience. Unless, and I work, for an agency, and we deal with a whole host of different types of psychosis. But you probably, if you're not in an agency, then you're dealing with a recognizable type of psychosis, right? You know what your boss is looking for. So figure out what it is and get them that one thing at a low fidelity. So it's really just checking the box and getting them out of your way so that you can continue along the path that you were going to move down anyway.
Absolutely.
Document, that's what we always say.
Just make it happen. All right.
All right, number 3. How do we justify this to upper management, right? They're not going to buy it.
Well, I think we talked about that quite a bit already, but I'll say one more thing about this. How many designers do we have in the room? Raise your hands. All right, that's what I like to see. All right, for you designers, this one's an underhand pitch. For the rest of us, channel that internal designer and make it happen. Here's how you sell it to upper management. Take some of the metrics we talked about today. Maybe take a look at how much it costs your business to acquire a new customer, and I guarantee you, acquiring 10 new customers is going to cost more than it costs to have three designers and 2 content folks sit in a room for 3 days and come up with the proper story ahead of time. The point is, grab a couple of metrics, you know what your boss likes, you know what that psychosis looks like, and design something pretty. Because there is nothing more that management likes, in my experience, than a pretty diagram that's based on real metrics. So that would be my first line of defense there. And again, I think that discussion that you can have about new customer acquisition versus what it's going to take to keep customers engaged the first time by actually creating that story, having the time to let that develop and take a guess and be wrong, is always going to be vastly cheaper. Run the numbers on the back of a napkin if you have to. That should be what it takes.
And I'm going to agree with this one too. There's the reason people are asking you for things is because somebody's asking them for things, right?
Exactly.
And it always comes all the way back around. So you can't ever get all the way up, because then everybody is your customer. They're asking for things of you too. These people are asking for specific things because they need to manage risk, be able to tell somebody where they're moving towards, be able to quantify the cost of what we're doing, all that stuff, right? And we are at a really beginning touch point of that stuff. And if we can, and knowing your psychosis, knowing what your management team's looking for, we can probably start guesstimating at what these costs are, right? And the cone of uncertainty can get smaller and smaller the closer and closer and more discovery we've done. What we really need to do is be able to upfront say, we're guessing about this. This is what the ballpark of it is, right? When you start talking in concrete terms and moving away from the design and development trends of not development, I'd say more design, right? Of being very emotional about how things are going to feel, and boy, it's just going to rock and you're going to love it. And so people are going to love it so much, they're just going to buy, and everyone's going to buy so much because it's in love with it. And like, if you can get away from that and actually get to some concrete information, that's going to resonate more with more people in the organization, because, there's a whole pile of beans sitting in the corner, and all they need to do is count beans, so let's give them some beans to count. Right? It's pretty simple. It gets back to knowing your audience, right? Being able to tell them what they need in order to get their job done. Because you're sitting as a developer or designer or a project manager or a PM or a project manager or whatever, you're sitting far enough up the slope to actually institute change. And in order to do that and make it so it doesn't impact your timelines and your deliverables, you have to play well with others. And so that's really what I'm saying here, right?
Yeah.
Play well with others, figure out what they want, out of your face, continue along the path that you need.
Exactly. Well said.
All right, what was my last one?
4, 3, 5?
4. I think we're at 4 now, right? Let's see.
All right.
Yeah, this is my favorite.
This one's
right? Like, no. Don't worry about talking to the user. I know who the user is. In fact, I'm the user. All you have to do is talk to me. I hear that every day, right? Or, anyone with a neck. I'm like, okay, well, babies have necks. Are you selling to babies? Well, no. Anybody that breathes oxygen. Okay, dogs breathe oxygen. Are you selling to dogs? So it gets back to this idea of like, we don't have to talk to anybody.
Right.
We got this. Don't ask anybody. We got this.
We don't have to tell that story. We don't have to create that story, because I am that story, even though in a lot of cases that boss man was that story 15 years ago, but he's been rotting in his office since then.
And so this is a really hard one to defend against. And this is the method that I'm doing now. I ask essentially everyone to picture in their mind's eye, and that kind of makes people mad too, right? Picture in your mind's eye a horse with a solitary horn that comes out. It's kind of braided up a little bit. And, it's very majestic and regal, right? And I'm leading them towards what we think they're going to be talking about. And then I ask everybody to describe what I just had. Right? Okay, so the CEO pictured a centaur, right? Totally off. Like not like maybe they got 4 legs, we'll give them that. The product manager, probably a little bit closer. The real, unicorn sitting in there. The designer throwing zebra stripes on the thing for some reason, right? And the developer who has already deconstructed it into, think wonderful unicorn meat.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
How come product manager doesn't like prints?
Yeah, everybody here is a print or a stripe, right? And she's a purist.
I see.
And if you
Good one.
her unicorn is as pure as the driven snow. So this is the problem here, right? We trying to get everybody on the same page. Everybody has to think about the unicorn that I'm painting the picture of. Hit me the next slide. This bad boy with rainbows and butterflies and all kinds.
Unicorn.
This is the thing we need to get to. And the best way to do that is to tell them a story about the unicorn up front. And everybody's got that idea in their head. We're all moving towards the same thing. And then personas become what they're supposed to be. And we fall back into this pattern of actually understanding who we're designing for, how it's going to impact their life, what it really does in the long run. And it's not just a wireframe to fix the problem that we didn't have the time to think of in the first place. Right?
Exactly. And I think the point here is that we've talked a lot about, whether you got it or not, how to actually do this, because the underlying tactics are things we do as human beings every single day. And we have somehow gotten ourselves to a place where we are so execution focused that we forget that we innately know how to tell stories. Telling stories is part of what makes us humans, and we've been doing it on the walls of caves since the beginning of time. And so this is really a lot less about creating a new deliverable or instituting a new practice, a new process, doing something that's innately human. So let's review.
You guys are already doing it.
Exactly.
We've been doing this, like he said, for forever. You're doing this right now if you're producing personas, if you're producing journey maps, even if you're producing user stories. You're pretty much doing this. Now just back up and do it right.
And we're making it extremely difficult on ourselves when we could be doing it in a way that's a lot easier. So 6 steps. That's 5. That's 6. 6 steps. Number 1, get out there and do it, right? If you're anywhere near the beginning of a project right now, go back on Wednesday, Thursday, whenever you're going to get back to the office. Hopefully you're taking the week off, next Monday, whatever it is. And start talking to whoever you can about the story that matters. Not the story that Jane in your persona embodies about how she's going to use 16 feature sets in your application in one 5-minute session, but the real story about how this thing is going to plug into her life.
I don't want to hear a user story about a one-armed pirate with a hook standing on a swaying vessel trying to transfer files from his investment funds to his bank account. Right? I'm like, now we're designing for the guy with the hook arm? Okay, well, that's not going to happen, right? We need to back up and stop maximizing the design of edge cases and focus on the core user, right? Cooper in his book About Face, we had the perpetuate intermediates, right? Everybody is 80% in the middle of this perpetuate intermediates. When you get new software, you don't like to get new software because you don't know what you're doing, typically. Nobody likes to be a loser and not know what's going on. So you got to move them into that middle space, right? If you're an expert, if you're that other 10% hanging off the other side, you're more inclined to be upset when stuff isn't working the way you want it to work because you figured out this crappy system and you just want to get in and get out, right? So we have to maximize the fact that we don't want to make those users mad, but also get the novice users into this perpetual intermediate space. And what we're really doing now is designing for perpetual intermediates and a little bit of advanced users. That's a lot easier than designing for anyone with a neck.
Exactly. And so when you get ready to start telling that story about your core users, find as many partners as you can, whoever it is. You might find that the person on the project team that you think is going to be the least valuable or the least bit of an ally to you ends up being the greatest champion with you of this story. Grab a developer, grab marketing people. Grab the rest of your design team if you can, if you are actually lucky enough to have a team, and start telling that story and make them tell stories. One important thing to keep in mind here is that everyone's story doesn't need to be the same, but they all need to revolve around that central theme. Everyone needs to be able to tell a story about those set of core users that matters to them, that they can repeat at home, on the train, in the shower, in a meeting in front of the boss. Whatever it is, they need to be able to tell a story that matters to them. And the way that we remember stories, the way that I remember the crazy stuff that happened last night that I told Michael about this morning, is because it affected me emotionally. I was engaged. Number 3, define that theme. As you start to tell stories to each other, that theme is going to come out really quickly. And don't be afraid to write it down. It doesn't have to be analyzed. It doesn't have to be data-driven. Write it down. After that, go about your UX business. We have defined processes that work. Doing the research, doing the personas, having all those findings influence journeys and wireframes and comps and sliced up images that go to development and all of that great stuff. Go about your business because you now have something to validate against. That's not a set of those nasty requirements we looked at before. Next, start to let your managers in on this. If you're not at the top of the pile, which if you are, you're very, very lucky, then start to bring people in when you can. Maybe you actually have a manager that's amenable to this idea. Bring them in for an hour a day while you're telling stories. Get him or her to tell a story. If not, you can start to spoon feed it along the way. Bring the big boss in for 25 minutes to see what you're doing. He may not like it when he sees it right there, but I guarantee you he'll think about it later at dinner, at home the next day, when he's zoning out in the same board meeting that you would zone out in if you had to go to. He'll be thinking about it. Give him something to think about. Give her something to think about. And lastly, this is a real important one, and we talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about trying to convince management. Not only do I truly believe in this, but I think we've read a couple of things just recently that kind of speak to the actual scientific power of this. Act like you have the answer. Because if you've actually listened to yourself, listened to your gut, and taken a guess at what the core story of your product is, that's something I'm willing to put money on. You're probably pretty close to right. And you're going to fail every now and then, but you're probably pretty close to right. So you have to believe that you have that answer, that you have that story internalized. And then the more you act like it, the more you actually stand up for that story, the more people are going to start believing that you do have the answer. And before you know it, they're going to be coming to you.
And I'm going to just fall in line with exactly what you said. You're the closest one in the organization to knowing the right answer at this point. You are probably closer to what the real solution is going to be because of the world that you live in and the environment, the digital ecosystem that you play with, all of the other things that you did that are very similar to this, the past history you've had, any UIs that you've been using that stick in your mind. You're closer to this than anyone else, so you're probably closer to being right than anyone else is. So put a stake in the ground, figure out where you're wrong, which is what we all do, right? We deconstruct designs as a client is talking to us, and all I do is postpone judgment until I break my framework, right? Developers do this too. I watch it all the time. So you're already doing it. Now all you have to do is just stand up and brush yourself off and own it. It's very scary, but some magic stuff happens. UX magic.
All right. That's it, guys. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we got pretty close. If there's any questions, we'll be over here on the corner.
Yeah, come grab us.
You can grab this. I think it was processing by the last time we checked, but you can grab it off of that.
And then buyer beware, but follow us on Twitter. I can't guarantee what's going to come out of there.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot.